Thank you, folks. Yeah. So I'm Michael. Yeah, mostly I split my time about 50-50 between Fort Frederica and Cumberland Island. I've been down at Cumberland Island all week this week, so I've been kind of neglecting my duties up here in the Golden Isles. We'll get started. So I know you guys are supposed to go on a trip, I hear, to Cumberland Island, and so in lieu of that, because that kind of got dwindled or canceled, we'll talk a little bit about some of the sites and the archaeology that you would have seen out there. Who's been to Cumberland Island? Right? Majority of you guys? Yeah, it's right south of us, right? We're here at Jekyll. This is Cumberland Island. I'll tell you one thing about Cumberland Island that I do not like. It's stupidly shaped because it's really hard to fit on a single piece of paper. It'd be better if it was a little bit more squat, right? It's our largest barrier island here in Georgia. We roughly say it's about 18 miles of beach, straight beach. It's an amazing location full of different types of resources. So, down here on the southern end, where probably most of you guys got to visit Dungeness, you got a lot of maritime forests, those beautiful live oaks and stuff. Most of you guys probably haven't had the opportunity to go up to the north end where the settlement, High Point, and those locations are. If you have, that part of the island is not like the rest of the island, right? That's more longleaf pine. We actually have longleaf pine savannas, and it's the older part of the island right here. So just for reference, we got kind of like Dungeness, Stafford, Plum Orchard, and then the settlement. Those are kind of our big locations in Brick Hill Bluff here. All right. Let's see what we got here. Here we go. So first we'll start off talking about, say, pre-contact. So, Native American. So we are the largest island. We have a lot of that. It's probably the most predominant type site that we have, but most of it looks like this, right? When we're out there doing excavations, you're gonna see these kind of sheet middens here, or this is a shovel test pit that we do. So there's different phases in archaeology. A phase 1 archaeological survey is usually gonna be, you're gonna read some books. Bruce and I were just talking about this. You're gonna try to identify your sites based on like ideal locations, and then you're gonna shovel test. Shovel testing is you're gonna dig a round or a square hole about 1 meter deep, about this wide. And what you're looking for is anything that somebody would have made, right? So that's archaeology, right? The study of man-made things. And so, here you have a shell midden, right? And it's on top of some sandy soil. And so what we do in archaeology is once you find enough of those shell piles, you can map densities and then you can map out sites through that. And that is a really good way of finding pre-contact locations, right? So you have these middens, some of those are obvious and some of those aren't, because they can be buried under debris. You can see here, so you have the midden right here, which is fairly close to the Dungeness boat dock, actually. And then, but you can't really see much on the surface, right? So you'd have to dig down a little bit deeper. We have the oldest pottery in the United States here in Georgia, right? It's called fiber temper. Anyone can look at that. Well, first off, I've got it backwards. So here's some of the shell tools and types of materials that we're going to be looking for when we're looking for pre-contact sites. You got some the hammers, or you got awls and all these different types of material. Awls right here. These are what you would find, right? So we don't have rocks here in southeast Georgia. It's not a thing. So at these pre-contact sites, what you're going to find most of is shell tools, right? That's how they were manufacturing their things, making beads, that kind of materials, net weights, all those things. So these are the predominant types of materials that you're going to find outside of ceramics. We do find chert, arrowheads, flakes and that, but those are pretty minimal on most of our sites that we have at Cumberland Island. I'm not talking too much about the pre-contact period because the archaeology at Cumberland, though it's the largest island, you would think it would get the most attention. It's pretty sparse. Charles Fairbanks came there in the 60s and he did some plantation archaeology, and then there was a gap until like the mid to late 70s, and most of the archaeology that has been done on this type of site, like pre-contact, is surface surveys. So people walking along the beach and going, hey, here's some shell, and here's some pottery. That must be something. But we haven't really gone back to actually investigate and do carbon dating and other types of materials on most of these sites. And we have about, I think, 75 right now on the island, which if we did probably a better job, we would have triple that, given the size of the island. This is some of the, I would say, the shell tools are pretty cool, pottery. Everybody loves pottery, right? But the fiber tempered stuff right here, that is going to be the oldest pottery you're going to find in North America, right? Dates to the archaic time period, and fiber tempered pottery basically is what if anybody here make pottery, you kind of need a temper to help harden it, hold it together. And what they did is they would put like Spanish moss or other types of fibers in there, and then when it burned out, it would leave these crazy craggly lines in it. And that's what you have there. And it's called Savannah. Well, there's different types. There's orange and there's Savannah. And they call that Savannah because that's the earliest place that they found it. Moving on, we have a lot of that. We've got a lot of Deptford, which is the woodland period, kind of 500 BC to 100 AD. We have a lot of St. John's. St. John's is really cool because it's really kind of chalky feeling, and a lot of their pottery would have been made with their temper is actually sponge spicules, so like sea sponges, when them dried up, crushed, and then they would have mixed those in, and they leave like little white lines, which is really cool. And then San Marcos is like a later. So this is kind of like 4 main time periods. There's a lot more types. Here's the great thing about Georgia, the Georgia coast, and particularly Cumberland Island. It's literally like the end point for so many different groups of people. The Makama, the Gwale, and all these people transitioning up and down, especially in the later like contact period. And so we're getting pottery types from all over the area, and so it's really hard to nail down, is this being manufactured here, or is it being manufactured somewhere else and being transitioned here, or was this a separate group? But these are kind of what we look for right now, and the main category types that I deal with. I'm currently just finished doing some what we call Section 106 archaeology. It's where we go do testing to find if there is archaeological material before we say put a parking lot in or a water line, or maybe trade land with folks, right? And in one very small area, we found all 4 types, right? Which is really cool. I don't know what it means. It's kind of crazy. Next period that we talk about a lot here on the coast and outside of St. Catharines, really, St. Catharines or maybe Darien, you don't have a lot to talk about, is the Spanish period. Obviously, the Spanish were the first Europeans really to come over here and settle and set up missions all over the place. Here's kind of a timeline of their interactions on Cumberland Island. They showed up in 1566 on accident. They established a small fort or presidio, and then they build a mission, and we don't know where those are. Right, there was multiple missions. There were multiple towns associated with those missions. We don't know exactly where any of those would have been located, unlike St. Catharines. I feel like if we did, we would be better than St. Catharines. But right now, they got one up on us on this. We do believe, and there has been a lot of research and studies, that Dungeness might have been one of the locations for either a mission or a associated village with one of those missions, but there's been no amount of material to actually confirm that, right? And you would be looking for features that would be associated with like post holes and pretty rectangular shaped structures or burials. We don't have that. What we do find is occasionally we get some maholica or we get some olive jar that erode out of a bank, but never in a quantity or concentration enough to say like, boom, this is clearly, a Spanish associated site. It may be there or it may not be there anymore, right? So unfortunately, like most of you guys know, you guys live in the coast, we're all dealing with erosional issues that only seem to be getting worse in the last few years. The marsh side of the island, and now the east side of the island on the ocean side, is suffering significant elevated rates of erosion. And so we're working actually with the University of Georgia and Georgia Tech and the Navy to study that erosion because it affects national security, right? Like the Navy base is over there. So if all our dirt falls into the river, their submarines can't go out into the ocean, right? So they're helping us with that right now. But we've seen accelerated rates. In the last 20 years, we're losing in some areas up to like 5 meters of dirt a year. Which is no bueno, right? The Spanish period, no bueno. After the Spanish leave, there's about a 40 or 50 year period where there's really nobody kind of in the islands, right? So the Spanish leave late 1680s. The English really don't show up until the 1730s when they found Savannah, 1733. So it's kind of a no man's land, if you will. It's kind of a vacant period. But on Cumberland Island, this is pretty cool. I actually helped with this project before I started working here when I worked at the Southeast Archaeological Center. General James Oglethorpe set up a series of forts, right? So you have Fort Frederica National Monument over there. That's one of those forts. There was Fort St. Simons, which is where the lighthouse is located today. He had little outposts on Jekyll, right? Horton House, that kind of things. And he had two forts on Cumberland Island. You had Fort St. Andrews and you had Fort Williams. Fort St. Andrews on the north end, Fort Williams was on the south end. So established in 1736, was largely housing the Highlanders out of Darien, right, or New Inverness then. Bless you. Originally, what we believe, this is a French drawing, right? It's all in French. I can't read that. I studied Spanish and Latin, so not so good. But we believe this is probably an idealized drawing of what Fort St. Andrews would have looked like. But we know there was a fort, and what it had probably a simple star fort, wooden palisades. And it was occupied in 1742 by the invading Spanish forces, right? So in 1742, the Spanish forces, after Oglethorpe's failed siege of St. Augustine, they did a reprisal raid. They came all the way up to St. Simons, and they lost against General James Oglethorpe at the Battle of Gully Hole Creek and the Battle of Bloody Marsh, right? And they're like, well, on our way out, let's do some damage. So they stopped over here at Fort St. Andrews on the tip of Cumberland Island and besieged it. Well, what the Highlanders had done is like, this isn't really the best of our forts. Fort William was actually better, so they ran south, kind of dispersed out. And so the Spanish occupied it, destroyed it, killed all the horses, threw them in a ditch, kind of thing, as you would do, right? And so it was destroyed, and it was not rebuilt, right? So in 2009, the Southeast Archaeological Center did a survey here, and we found part of it. You can see right here. And actually, 2006, Carolyn Rock had done a survey to suggest very likely where it was located. They did some really large excavation units in like 2009, 2010, 11. And that's what you're finding right here. Is a lot of 18th century artifacts, buttons, all these kind of cool things. I have a slide about that. But you also have the ditch right here. You can see how the ditch comes up. And then it's been filled in, right there. It's kind of wonky. And then in another unit right here, it's like a lot of this really nice dark dirt, which is really cool because usually dark dirt means people were living there and doing great things. But this little brown thing right here is actually a wooden post, right, from the palisade. Pretty cool, right? Interesting thing is talking about pre-contact. So Fort St. Andrews was built on top of a Native American site. And then the ditches were refilled, so it's full of Native American material as well, right? Reuse, recycle, I think, maybe. Some of the materials that were recovered from that, so you got some gun flints, cannonballs, right? Historic coins that dated to the 1730s, thank God, right? Because if it did not, that'd be bad. But, hand-wrought nails, like I said, a lot of Native American pottery, 3,886 pieces. It's a lot. Different types of shot, tobacco, gunflint. The best part about it is when you kind of really looked at all the pieces, they dated to pre-1742, right? Like all the farthings and pennies date to pre-1742. So that all jives, except for that one. Don't worry about that guy. That's 1798, 1 cent. Don't worry about that. Actually, I was recently there about a year and a half ago with some interns, and we were doing some excavations just down the way, and we found a Whig button. So when the Whig Party was running for president, we found one of those, which was pretty cool. So doesn't mean the fort was occupied. Just means, see, like here. So what we did is we actually did find the fort. What we did find is that the fort is almost entirely gone, right? If you go to the north end of Cumberland Island, you'll see it's got a really high bluff that overlooks the Cumberland River. It's an amazing place to shoot people from, and you can see that it's eroding on a daily basis, right? And that has a lot to do with nor'easters and the way that the tides and stuff work. It's just eroding out the base, and when the base erodes, the tops. So when I did, wrong way. When we did this excavation unit right here in 2009, it wasn't 7, it was 2000. Well, there was one in 7, but we did it in 9. The bluff was right here, like over this way, maybe another 3 feet. It's now here. So this entire excavation unit is gone. And I was just up there this past week, and I could see the nails from this, and everything else was in the ocean. So that's how much we're losing, and that's what you're looking at 10, 15 years. Pretty rapid rate. What is interesting about this is that we've identified the Fort St. Andrew. There was a town associated with that, the town of Barry-Mackey, where so the Highlanders did go there. They weren't like driving back and forth to New Inverness or Darien. They brought their wives with them, right? And they set up a town on St. Simons called Barry-Mackey. We have not found that yet, but we do know it should be within 1 mile to 2 miles of the fort near fresh water. So it's pretty limited locations, right, is where that should be. And so having the fort location is pretty crucial to us to being maybe able to locate the town of Barry-Mackey. What I'd like to do next is, this is a early 1800s map of Cumberland Island. So you have the town of St. Mary's here. Here's Fort Tammy. So this is like War of 1812 style map. It's pretty low. If you guys are familiar with them, here's the Staffords, but that's actually the ice house at Dungeness Dock, right? The Staffords are now here, right? So back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, they operated a store at the south end of the island where the ice house is located, and the Dungeness Dock is, and then they moved up north. It's pretty cool. But as you can see here, there's a little red square down here. That's Fort William, right? And we haven't found any evidence of that yet. Now, there's pretty good probability that that eroded out completely into the ocean, and this would be a better one to, I say not a better one, they're all cool, right? But this would be a really cool one to find, because this one was actually occupied for a lot longer, all the way through like the American Revolution and a little bit later, and a small town sprung up around it for a little while, because the sheriff here in St. Mary's was murdering people, so people started coming over here, right? It's pretty crazy stuff. And so there's a lot of cool history there. We know that this had vaulted brick vaults and some other stuff, so it's probably more substantial as well. Unfortunately, we believe that the island in natural processes probably cut right through this and eroded out. Now, after the 1880s jetty was put in, the island built back out, right? So if you look at a modern map, you would be like, oh no, the fort's still there. But you have to look at the maps from 1780 to 1880, and you're like, oh no, actually it eroded out and now it's grown back. But we don't know that yet. We're gonna hopefully find that out soon. So moving into the next, so I talked a little bit about the Staffords here, the plantation period. So after, the War of Jenkins' year, the colony and the trustees kind of broke up. That's when the plantations really came in strong here to Georgia. So slavery is illegal, right, initially. After about 1751, slavery is not illegal, and so huge chunks of land are starting to be split up. Cumberland Island was no stranger to that. Later on, the Staffords would become a major player in the island, leading up until the Civil War, and they would own a huge chunk of land. So the Stafford chimneys, this is currently on private property that will eventually become part of the National Park Service, so it's what we call a life estate. So when the owners pass away, it will revert to the National Park Service. Now, Charles Fairbanks did a little bit of archaeology here back in the 1960s, and that kind of was a spurring moment for African American and plantation archaeology, like as a subject. And then the Southeast Archaeological revisited the Stafford chimneys in 2000 to 2003. And this is kind of what you're seeing. These are their excavation units at just one chimney. So they opened up whole houses, right? It's pretty significant process. They didn't excavate every chimney. There's about 27 chimneys. They did not do that. When you're doing archaeology, right, it's a destructive science. Once you dig it out, you can't put it back, right? And so what you want to do is you want to get the information that you're looking for, but make sure you leave enough for future generations. Should we have better questions, better techniques, better technologies, and stuff like that, so that they can come back in and then they can do better work. You see some cool stuff as they're excavating these glass bottles, really cool pearl oil cups and stuff. And then here you got the chimney right there. Here's some of the finds, right? An interesting thing about this is, so we did the Stafford chimneys. We also did Rayfield, which is a little bit further north, closer to King's Bottom. It's like middle of the island near Plum Orchard area. They were finding that the materials there were unexpected, right? There were some items of adornment, personal items. We were finding locks and keys. So it seems like there might have actually been some sense of ability to like have personal space or at least secure your items, which would be unexpected or probably absent from other plantations that were on the mainland, right? So if you're in Virginia, you're probably not seeing some of these things like you're seeing here. Now that could also be that, and also I would say for Stafford in particular and Rayfield, they were not like reused after the Civil War. So it wasn't like they have a long period of occupation. They were used up to the Civil War and then they were either destroyed or dismantled. So there was no reoccupation afterwards. So these materials wouldn't date, say, to a later freedmen's colony settlement particularly. So you have a lot of buckles, but you also see some of these like jeweled adornment items. This is, I think it's a tooth with a hole drilled into it, so it was a pendant, right? Pretty cool. Tobacco pipes, but they're very ornate. This is a polychrome cup, so like lots of colors. You would expect to find mostly mundane type of pottery and ceramics. Gun flints. I don't know how, if you thought that they had their own weapons, but they did, and it was very clear that they were hunting and gathering their own food as well, so deer, rabbits, that kind of stuff. So in addition to gun flints, we were finding munitions, like lead shot, and other things as well. Ornate beads. We have a lot of blues, but there's a lot of other colors too. Blue usually holds a very significant spiritual color for the African American, especially West African traditions. Sewing, thimbles, needles, and that. So they're either fixing up their clothes, making new clothes, or even working out to barter for other items. And then arrowheads. So why would they have arrowheads? They wouldn't really need arrowheads. Well, people like to collect things, right? And if you're out working in the field all day, this is the most reasonable explanation I can get. And the field that they happen to be working in, if you've been to the island Stafford Field, happens to be a giant site, right? And so as they're plowing it or they're planting, they're probably finding a lot of ceramics, they're finding a lot of things, and they're bringing them back to their cabins because that's what we do, right? I don't keep anything in my house. So but people do. Yeah. This is what they look like today. So a couple years ago, because of all the archaeology we did, we knew what the houses looked like. Like we knew what with the foundations, they were post holes. We knew the size and dimensions, and based on the chimneys and their structures, we actually knew where the roof peak should be on these bad boys. And we were having a lot of problems. So these are largely tabby brick chimneys with a red brick firebox base. So lots of erosion, right? Tabby doesn't usually handle weather very well. That's why we cover it in lime plaster. These were not lime plastered. And so they were starting to lean, they were starting to tip, they were starting to deteriorate to a point. So we actually got a really good project in, and we remade all these bricks by hand. We had a company come out. Actually, what we did is we gave this company bricks, said these bricks are from the chimneys. They took them, they analyzed them, and to the exact same specifications, they handmade new tabby bricks. They handmade new mortar to match the existing mortar, parge coach, all that stuff. So it was all made to the exact specifications. And then all the red brick that we had to replace, that's kind of hard, right? Because that's a pretty specific red brick. It was Savannah gray bricks, right? Well, they were tearing a warehouse down in Savannah, and so we managed to acquire enough brick out of Savannah that they matched, and they were from the right time period. And for a handful of these, what we also found doing the archaeology is that these chimneys, there is actually no base to these chimneys. They are literally just sitting on the ground. Well, that is a lot of weight sitting on sand. To say that they've been freestanding for about 150 years is pretty phenomenal, but a lot of them didn't look like they were going to be standing for much longer. And we used this opportunity initially that they wanted to do is they wanted to create these hug collars around them, and that was going to hug them, and they were going to dig bollards in. And I was like, well, let's take the opportunity to build some ghost structures, and that's what these are. And so when the individuals do pass away and it becomes the National Park Service, we'll actually have a really good interpretive element to show people what these structures would have looked like, right? So you would have had 27 cabins look like this, all in rows down this way. And so I think it's a really great opportunity. You guys just probably won't be able to see it for another 20 years. So, yeah, maybe not. I don't know. We'll see. Yeah. I'm not wishing anything on anybody, right? You know. But we were only really able to do this because of the archaeology that had been done previously, right? So they were looking at the post holes and all that stuff and some really cool elements. And then when we did this project, we did more archaeology. So wherever we were putting bollards in the ground, so every single one of these points right here has a giant concrete base that goes 2.5 feet in. We excavated that out as well and found the same types of materials that we had found previously. So post-plantation, this is what I've been dealing with mostly right now, and we have recently located a previously unknown freedmen's settlement at Brick Hill. So freedmen's settlement, so 1863 to, the Union kind of occupied coastal Georgia or the coastal Berry Islands, pretty much up and down the entire United States. And when they do that, they're all free, right? But they don't have a place to go. So what they do a lot of times is, so over here on St. Simon's Island, there was a freedmen's settlement that was probably closer down to where the lighthouse and the pier village is located. So a lot of freed blacks would come, or escapes, would try to make their way over there, right? Try to get off the mainland, get to the island, that they could get freedom and go on somewhere else, or they can make a life for themselves here. So after 1863, up at Brick Hill, it was owned by the Downses. So they're out of Fernandina, St. Augustine location. If you guys are familiar with Pippi Longstockings, the Downs house is Pippi Longstocking's house, right? Yeah, weird, interesting facts that I know that I shouldn't know. And so 1863, the plantation was kind of an absentee ownership kind of run. Like they had a caretaker, but they weren't really on property. And so they evacuate to Amelia Island. The facility is left vacant. And so the freedmen's take over, and they continue to live within the houses that they were already living in. Other people from the island kind of move into that area as well. There was 2 different locations. Some of the freed slaves move up to Brick Hill, some of the freed slaves move to Dungeness, and then some move off island, right? Because it's tough to make a living on an island at that time period. And so from 1863 to about 1898, they're living at Brick Hill Bluff. The only reason they move out of Brick Hill Bluff is because land becomes available to them at what is called the settlement today. If you guys have heard the First African Baptist Church up on the north end, they're the ones that built that, right? So land becomes available for purchase. They're squatting. For those 30 years, they're kind of squatting, and they're fighting with the landowners, the Downses. The Downses sell that land to a speculator, and he says, I'm going to develop it, you got to go. And then at the same time, High Point is developed, and they're looking for people to work at their brand new hotel, so they allow them to buy some of the property, and that's how the settlement is created, right? Well, up until about 3-4 years ago, we didn't know that this existed in any capacity. And what we found out was that there's about all these things. These are called, this is a density map of brick in the area. So Brick Hill campground down here somewhere, pretty close. All these brick scatters are chimneys in different buildings. And this map aligns with an 1880s map that shows the remnants of the Downs plantation all in a line. And then here's a very convoluted map, but it basically is looking at different shovel tests and stuff, and then all these little X's, and then these different dots are different types of materials that we're recovering, like historic ceramics, historic glass. We are also mapping out shell middens. So shell middens can be prehistoric, but they can also be historic, right? Because, if I'm eating oyster, I'm throwing my oyster in a pile. That becomes a midden, right? That's pretty cool. And now this project, we're working with the Southeast Archaeological Center, and what we've done is we identified, hey, we got some buildings we didn't know about, or at least the foundations of some stuff out here in the woods, in the wilderness. And we found some census records, from the 1870s and the 1880s, and we have lists of names now of individuals that would have lived at Brick Hill during this time period, where they're from, what they're related to, trimmings. If you guys have been up Alberti, so the Alberti house is the one that's up there that's available that you might have used the bathroom in if you've been. on any of the Lands and Legacies tours, right? Quash Germain, pretty big name. They are some of the individuals that helped build the first African Baptist church. And we believe that this stereograph may be a picture of one of the structures at Brick Hill. And so it's listed as a former slave cabin on Cumberland Island and owned by one of these individuals, right? Or lived in at one point in time. So it's kind of tough to know, but we think that might actually be one of the things that we're looking at, which is really cool because, doing archaeology, we don't always have pictures of the things we're digging up. We got to make it up in our heads sometimes. So here you go. Brick Hill Campground. Here is the 1880s map. Like I said, there's some structures here, and there's some structures going up here as well. And so we've excavated 2 of these so far. The community well, that would be this one. This would be the first structure we found. I actually found it walking out in the woods, just randomly. Well, I was looking at this map and I was like, there should be something out here. And I was walking in the woods, which is horrible because those woods are miserable. And I walked on a square patch of moss. I was like, moss doesn't grow in squares. So I kicked the moss and out came bricks. And so out of that is this project. And so what we found here was this is the pile of bricks. Most of the bricks are gone now. But we believe this to be the well for the community, actually. And so that would be this area right here, because it was kind of like a barrel well setup, if you see here. And then the next year, I pulled off the side of the road and parked my car. And then when I backed up, I had uncovered this chimney. So they were like, you ran over a brick. And I was like, there was no bricks there when I parked. They're like, no, when your tire moved, the brick popped out of the ground. And I was like, I'm that good, guys. Trust me. So we excavated this past year, these 2 things, this past 2 years, working with the Eastern Tennessee State University. I don't know if you guys have ever had a talk by Dr. Lindsay Cochran. She used to be at University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and then she was a postgrad at University of Georgia, but she's been worked on Sapelo, Ossabaw, and a bunch of the barrier islands, and now she's at Eastern Tennessee State. So we have a program now. So she runs summer field schools at Cumberland, and she stays at the dormitories in Dungeness, and this is where she's working, right? She just presented some of the findings this year at the national conference, which was held in Williamsburg, which is really cool. I didn't get to go, I had work to do. One of the cool things about working at Brick Hill, so I showed you guys those blue buttons, those blue beads and stuff. This is the type of pottery that we're finding, which is not fairly uncommon. You got blue edge shell, you got shell edged pearlware. It's blue. Some transfer print blue. Annulaware is largely blue. Some other colors. It's really, you find that anywhere. But the percentage of blue versus other colors is out of this world. Almost 80+% of the pottery or ceramics that we're finding at the site are blue in color. That we believe is showing an indication of choice versus like what's available. They are choosing to acquire blue pottery. And we believe that's probably because of the spiritual significance, because blue holds a deeper meaning in the Gullah Geechee culture than that, and it has to go a bit West African. And we actually just discussed this with the Gullah Geechee National Heritage Quarter last week, and we presented some of this slide to them and mentioned this, and they'd all just nodded their heads that, yes, we were right. That's probably what they're doing, which is really cool. When you go to a lot of these other sites, you're going to see a lot of browns and greens, and you're going to see what's available, not what they want. So it looks like from those 30 years where they were occupying of their choice, they were eating and drinking and using the things that they wanted to eat, which is pretty cool. One of the other stuff we have, not that often, actually, let's see. I'm not in this picture because I'm taking the picture, but that's my buddy Eric right there. So shipwrecks, right? We got 18 miles of coastline. There's a lot of shoals in that area. If anybody's ever tried to boat, around the jetty or up at Christmas Creek, maybe not the best. Stafford Shoals was a historically notorious location for people to get wrecked on from the 17 to 1800s. This was located on the beach. Somebody found a small piece of wood sticking out that didn't look normal. They reported it to the previous resource manager, John Fry. who's now retired, his position I hold now. And he asked Eric and I to come out and take a look at it. When we started, it just kept going and kept going and kept going. I think it was almost 80 meters long. And we don't believe it was the entire side of the vessel. So you're looking at a pretty significant sized vessel. We dated it to, based on construction, so it was wooden pegs, and there was some metal and some sheathing. So probably early 1800s, give or take. But we couldn't. Unfortunately, what happened with this is there wasn't a lot of materials in it. So it's clearly, it broke up probably in the ocean, and then the part washed ashore. And then as the dunes were eroding, so this actually is like roughly near where Duck House Crossing is, Duck House Trail is just up the road right here. And I'm only telling you guys that because this doesn't exist anymore. It's completely gone. So about a month after we excavated, mapped, and drew the whole thing, a storm came through and washed the entire thing out. Yeah. So it's completely gone, but we did get the data. And I believe that probably as the dunes, if you have been out to the beach right now, the dunes are really taking a beating from some of the storms that we've had lately. So we'll probably see more of this, I think, coming in the future, because the island, it moves left and right, up and down. Moves a little bit less now because of the jetty, right? Because now the sand that would have moved from north to south just gets stuck, at the jetty. So we're going to grow out into the ocean eventually. It'll take a while. But we don't have a lot of shipwrecks. That's the biggest, most major one. We have a couple of smaller barges. We're probably like oyster barges, probably from the 1890s that are in the marsh areas. And those are a lot harder to get to because you can't drive to those. So that's like, I don't want to do that. Right. And I didn't have a picture of it, but I will mention we do have one plane on the island. It's actually a World War II fighter bomber. We're not quite sure what it is. And we're not sure if it was a training accident out of NAS Jacks during World War II or post-World War II. Or sometimes what they would do is they would take destroyed fighters or bombers or airplanes and they would lay them out to do practice search and rescues. But all that's left of that is basically the engine block out in the dune field. Some of our biggest problems that we're facing right now is shoreline erosion. Where we do have seawalls, this is what they look like. Well, we fixed it, but it used to look like this, right? And this is Dungeness seawall. We just had that remortared this past year. That is our biggest issue. So we are losing lots of ground to that. Which is causing havoc not only for the cultural resources, but for the natural resources, right? Marsh loss, so on and so forth. But cultural resources, I think, are really taking a beating. Most of your pre-contact sites, most of all our sites, right, are on the marsh side of the island. And you would think that would be the most stable, but that's where all the rivers are. And the rivers have really strong currents, and we have 7-foot tides, right? And that differentiation in between that. So at the Brick Hill site, I'm actually working with the University of North Florida to do an oyster bed restoration to hopefully stop wave action from eroding that bluff line. And it's funny that we say bluffs, but they're only like this tall, But that's like just enough height for those waves to cause serious damage and erode those things out. And they said, well, we can try it, but we're not quite sure because the tides are so extreme in our area. It's really tough. You'd have to build multiple sets of walls, right? Like one for low tide, one for high tide. And so it's really hard. And, we don't want to go the risk of like doing what the Carnegies did and just put rocks everywhere, right? Or, seawalls, because that just kind of takes away from the character a little bit. And also it's super expensive. Other problems we have that you guys probably don't have is hogs, right? This is actually a prehistoric site. And here the hogs are looking for something good to eat. And this is pretty common on the marsh side where they're going looking for like tubers and other kinds of things like that. They will just chew up an entire area, right? And so pretty bad on the archaeology, really tears up the top. I mean, they can get pretty deep too. And so those are two of our bigger problems that we are facing right now with the cultural resources and archaeology. And I think, though, we do have a guy that just shoots hogs. So that's his job. So he does the best he can. I go, hey, Doug, there was a hog over here. And he's like, got it. I'll go get it. Yeah. He's actually on the island tonight, hunting hogs at Stafford. So, yeah, we'll get him. That's as much as I have for talking about the different types of sites and the history of the island. If you guys have any questions about it.
So when you talk about the Stafford chimneys, those were slave cabins?
Yes.
Okay, so those were all chimneys related to the slave cabins?
Yes, we believe probably constructed around 1820 initially, so and then occupied up to the Civil War time period. The story is that Robert Stafford, who was the owner there, in spite of their freedom, burned all the cabins down. The great thing about the archaeology tells you that didn't happen. Because if all the buildings burned down, the nails would be burned, the pottery would be burned, there would be burned timbers, there'd be ash, there'd be all kinds of evidence there. Not a lick of that. So pretty sure that story is bunk. What we think happened is that the slaves did leave Stafford and they dismantled those cabins and took the materials to Dungeness and Brick Hill. And they rebuilt their cabins out of those structures. So why make new lumber when you've got 27 buildings right here and you hate that guy? So you just take his stuff and you go over. Yes, ma'am. The longest projects that we have right now on Cumberland's probably the Brick Hill project, so we're going on 4 years right now.
What's the shortest project?
Shortest project? Let's see. I had to dig one shovel test so we could put a new well in at our park housing, and it took me 30 minutes. There you go. Yeah, so there's several different sets of chimneys on the island. Stafford and Rayfield have been the most investigated. We're working on Brick Hill, which we believe date to the early 1800s as well, and then were occupied all the way through the 1890s. So that's pretty cool. So you have some really good evidence of like how they were used during the plantation period right at Stafford, because we know they weren't occupied after. And then at Brick Hill, we're like, okay, how are they reusing this site? But also at Dungeness, there's two different sets of cabins as well. There's a set of cabins that would have dated to General Nathaniel Greene's ownership, and we believe those were washed out by a hurricane. They'd have been close to the duck pond location. We haven't found any evidence of those. We've done a lot of testing for that area, and then those were moved to a different location that we haven't confirmed yet. Yeah, after about 1820. No question? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
What's the difference of depth when you find an artifact that's 500 BC and then you find one at 17th century? Are you saying, are they like on top of each other, 3 feet apart, 1 feet apart? How deep are you digging these?
The common answer is it depends, right? So usually when you see like when you do see the stuff on TV, right, and they have like huge gaps and stuff, because they get a lot of soil deposition. We're kind of fortunate, like we don't flood around here too much, right? There's a little bit of flooding in some of the areas, but we don't get a lot of soil. So these things are like stacked right on top, or in a lot of areas, thanks to hogs or other animals and things like they're commingled. Right, so gopher tortoises are amazing animals, and they dig giant burrows that go 40 feet in the ground, and they dig up all kinds of stuff. So gopher tortoise burrows will have all of it in like one little pile. Okay. Yeah, but they're pretty close. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
What about African American cemeteries? Are there any designated cemeteries on the island, like maybe towards the north end where the church is?
So there's a few historic cemeteries. There's the Miller Green one at Dungeness, the one at Stafford, the Carnegie one that's just right there, but Dungeness as well. That's more of a modern one, historically modern. There's an African cemetery component at the settlement. There is a cemetery up there for the Candlers and the settlers of the settlement. So like half is black and half is the white. And then we believe that there's actually a cemetery at the Brick Hill location as well. So before they moved.
But you haven't found it?
Not all of it, no.
And Zabet's grave is still unknown?
Yeah, I've talked to Lindsay Cochran, who I mentioned about this, because clearly there should be more burial grounds, because if you have slaves on the island for as long as they did, they're obviously burying people and it's kind of tough, right? So in like West Africa, particularly West Africa, talk about West African, you want to be buried close to water, right? That's kind of like, it's really close to their thing. And it has a lot to like returning back to Africa, so water and shells and stuff like that, which is great, except for in archaeology, because we've just talked about all the erosion we've had. So if you're burying close to, say, the edge of the marsh in 1800, that could be 100 feet out into the Brickell River now, right? And so there are probably opportunities where they might be closer in. We believe one of the early praise houses or churches was close to Plum Orchard. So if you were to go up if you go on a tour and you go up to Plum Orchard and you kind of veer to the left, up that area near that tidal slough, we believe is where like one of the first churches on the island was located.
And it's now probably underwater or totally demolished.
The church is not, but usually like Praise House probably not called a church at that time, is not. We think we know where that is, but there hasn't been much testing. We just know that might be some stuff in the woods in a certain area. But if they're not burying people like next to the Praise House. They're not like we have churches and we have cemeteries right next to each other, but burial grounds usually aren't always next to like the Praise House. And then also that was like a Praise House that would have served, if you've ever been to the island, Stafford slaves were walking up to Plum to go to service. And Rayfield, and they were coming from long ways away. And then what we do know from records is that a lot of these ceremonies were happening at night, too. Outside the prying eyes of the landowners who let them do it. But they weren't around, so there's a lot they didn't know what was going on or where, probably. So there's not a lot of records. That's the tough part. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. You've been there.
I know, but that doesn't mean that I can't have any questions.
Yeah.
You don't always answer all my questions.
Yes, go.
How far are you allowed to dig in the ground?
It's a good question. So normally, state standards, our standards, usually a meter or sterile soil. So whatever comes first. Meter is 3 feet. That's about as deep as you're going to get in most areas around here because, we live on the water, right? So the deepest hole I've ever dug was probably 9 feet deep. Yeah. Don't tell OSHA. So it's probably not the best thing to do. I was younger and dumber then, so yeah. Good. Anybody got anything else?
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.